Turn a faucet on Camp Lejeune today, and the water runs clear, odorless. Trusted, the way water is trusted by people who don't think about it. But for roughly 34 years, that same clarity was a lie. 2 of the base's 8 water systems carried industrial solvents, degreaser, dry cleaning fluid, fuel, at levels that would later be measured in the hundreds and even thousands of parts per billion, against a legal limit of 5. Up to 1 million people may have drunk it. The babies drank it first, and a contract lab wrote the warning down. Nobody moved fast enough. That's the part that should stop you. Not that the water was poisoned. Water gets poisoned. It's that this happened on a United States Marine Corps base, the single most rule-bound, order-obsessed institution in the country, in the family housing where the wives and newborns lived, and the warning existed on paper years before anyone shut the wells off. To understand how that's possible, you have to understand what Camp Lejeune actually was. Not a town, a machine that ran its own everything. It started with a war and a stretch of empty North Carolina coastline. In 1942, with the country scrambling to build amphibious forces for the Pacific, the Marine Corps needed a training ground on the East Coast, open Atlantic beaches for practicing landings, deep river access, and enough raw acreage to fire artillery without hitting anyone. They found it in Onslow County, along the New River. They named it for John A. Lejeune, the 13th Commandant, a man whose reputation was built on discipline and loyalty. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. Hold on to that phrase. It comes back with a knife in it. The scale is the first thing that matters. The base swallowed roughly 156,000 acres, about 244 square miles. That is not an installation. That is a small state. And because it sat far from any city that could pipe water in, Camp Lejeune did what a self-sufficient military city does. It drilled its own wells, built its own treatment plants, ran its own utility. 8 separate water systems, each pulling from the aquifer directly beneath the base, each serving a different chunk of the map. Here is where the land starts hiding the future problem, because the same ground that held the drinking water also held the base's industrial life. Maintenance shops that degreased engine parts with solvents, a fuel farm with underground tanks, waste disposal areas where nobody in the 1950s thought twice about what soaked into the dirt. All of it sitting on top of, or upstream of, the same water table feeding the taps. The strength of the place, total self-sufficiency, answerable to no outside city utility, no outside regulator watching a single faucet, was exactly the flaw that would let the poison move in the dark for decades. Nobody was looking. That's not an excuse. It's a mechanism. In the 1950s and 60s, there was no federal rule forcing anyone to test drinking water for trichloroethylene or perchloroethylene. The 5 parts per billion limit that would later damn these readings didn't even exist yet. So the water could be filthy and technically legal at the same time, and the men running the base could say, honestly, that nothing had been flagged because nobody had built the instrument to flag it. Meanwhile, the base filled up with the people who would pay for that gap. Not the combat Marines in the barracks. The families. Tarawa Terrace, a housing area built specifically for young Marines with wives and small children, drew its water from a system that would turn out to be among the worst. Down the road, the Hadnot Point system served workshops, the Naval Hospital, and more housing, sitting closest to the fuel farm and the industrial waste. Picture it the way it actually looked. Rows of modest housing, kids on bikes, a commissary, a chapel, schools, a hospital with a maternity ward, wives filling baby bottles at the kitchen sink, running baths for newborns, boiling water for formula, because on a Marine base, you do not question the water. The whole culture is built on trusting the system above you. That trust was the delivery mechanism. By the early 1950s, the wells at Tarawa Terrace were already pulling water toward those homes. And roughly half a mile away, an ordinary off-base dry cleaner called ABC 1-Hour Cleaners was doing what dry cleaners did, dumping solvent waste that would seep slowly, invisibly, straight toward the wells that fed the youngest people on the base. The trap was set. Nobody had sprung it yet, and everyone above those faucets still believed the water was the safest thing on the base. By the 60s, Camp Lejeune wasn't just working, it was thriving. In the loud, crowded, ordinary way a military city thrives when the mission never stops. And that ordinariness is the whole point. Nothing about the place looked dangerous. It looked like home. Walk through Tarawa Terrace in those years and you'd see a neighborhood, not a hazard zone. Laundry on lines, screen doors, a young mother married to a lance corporal, filling a bottle at the tap the same way she'd done 100 times, mixing powdered formula with water straight from the faucet, because that's what the manufacturer said to do, and that's what everyone did. Down the block, another wife running a warm bath for a newborn. This was the daily rhythm of the most contaminated water system on the base. Not soldiers, not machinery, but infants and pregnant women, getting the highest doses through the most intimate acts of care. That's the reversal nobody saw coming. The barracks Marines, the men the whole base existed to train, were largely on other systems. The worst water flowed to the family housing. The people with the least armor got the most poison, and the poison had a chemistry to it. This wasn't one vague chemical. At Tarawa Terrace, the dominant contaminant was perchloroethylene, PCE, the dry cleaning solvent creeping in from ABC 1-hour cleaners, eventually measured at levels reported in the low hundreds of parts per billion. At Hadnot Point, the main culprit was trichloroethylene, TCE, the industrial degreaser, with peak readings that would later be cited around 1,400 parts per billion. Alongside them came benzene from the leaking fuel farm and vinyl chloride, a breakdown product of the others. Set that against the safety limit that would eventually be set at 5. 1,400 against 5, nearly 300 times over a line that didn't yet exist. Now here's the cruelty of the timing. Because the 5-part limit wasn't established until 1989, for the entire span that families were drinking this water, the base was, on paper, breaking no rule. The instrument that would have screamed hadn't been invented, so the water could poison a child and violate nothing. For a while, it worked. It worked the way these places always work, through routine, through payroll, through the 1,000 small anchors that make a base feel permanent. The commissary lines, the base schools where the kids of exposed families learned to read, the chapel, the naval hospital where the babies were born, some of them already carrying the consequences of 9 months of contaminated water, though no one would say so for decades. Families stayed for years. Marines transferred out and transferred back. Grandparents visited. Reunions happened. People built lives on top of the aquifer without a single reason to distrust what came out of the wall. That trust ran deep, and it wasn't naive. It was the whole culture. Semper Fidelis isn't a slogan you put on a coffee mug at Lejeune. It's the operating principle. You are faithful to the core, and the core is faithful to you and yours. You do not stand at your kitchen sink wondering whether the institution that trains your husband to die for the country is quietly delivering solvent to your baby's bottle. The idea would have been obscene, so nobody thought it. And that unthinkability was armor for the problem. It kept the question from ever being asked. Among the children drinking that water was a boy named Mike Partain, born on the base in 1968. He'd grow up, leave, live an ordinary life, and then, as an adult, be diagnosed with male breast cancer, a disease so rare it accounts for well under 1% of all breast cancers. He had no idea yet that he was one node in a pattern. That comes later. And among the families who would carry the deepest wound was that of a Marine named Jerry Ensminger, a career man, a drill instructor, someone who gave the better part of his adult life to the Corps and believed in it the way you believe in gravity. His daughter Janie was conceived while the family drank the Lejeune water. She was born, and she seemed fine. The problem with this poison is that it doesn't announce itself at the tap. It waits. It shows up years later, in a diagnosis, in a ward, in a name added to a list nobody yet knew was being written. By the late 1970s, the base looked exactly like what it was supposed to be: a functioning, faithful, permanent piece of American military power. Thousands of families, their own schools, their own hospital, their own clean-looking water. The warning was already coming. It just hadn't reached paper yet. The discovery, when it finally came sideways. Nobody went looking for the poison. In the early 1980s, the base was preparing to comply with a new EPA rule on trihalomethanes, a completely different category of contaminant. To meet it, Camp Lejeune hired an outside firm, Granger Laboratories, to test the water, and Granger kept finding things it wasn't looking for. Solvents. Their reports, sent back to the base, flagged the water as heavily contaminated with organic chemicals. The language was blunt enough that it should have ended the story right there. It didn't. The most contaminated wells, the ones feeding Tarawa Terrace and Hadnot Point, stayed in service. Not for weeks, for a year, in some cases longer, before they were finally taken offline in 1984 and 1985. That gap between the lab writing it down and the base shutting it off is the moral center of this whole thing. The warning existed. The wells kept running. Read that twice, because the institution eventually would have to. When the wells were finally capped, the immediate danger stopped. But the reckoning hadn't even started. In 1989, Camp Lejeune was added to the EPA's Superfund National Priorities list, one of the most contaminated sites in the country, officially. And here's the contradiction that defines the place. It earned that toxic designation while remaining a fully active Marine Corps base. Flag flying, reveille every morning, a Superfund site, and a functioning installation at the same time. Shutting the wells was the easy part. Telling the families was the part that took forever. And this is where the poison stops being chemistry and becomes something closer to betrayal. Janie Ensminger, Jerry's daughter, conceived in that water, was diagnosed with leukemia and died in 1985, 9 years old. Her father buried her, believing it was just the cruelty of the universe. He did not learn that the water might have killed her until 1997, 12 years later, and he did not learn it from the Marine Corps. He learned it from a news broadcast. A man who gave 24 years to the Corps found out his daughter's death might trace back to the base tap the way any stranger would, from the television. That broadcast turned a grieving father into the most relentless investigator the story would ever have. Jerry Ensminger started pulling records, connecting families, refusing the word inconclusive. He was joined by Mike Partin, the boy born on the base in 1968, now a man with male breast cancer. Partin began hunting for others like him. He found them. Eventually, he documented a cluster of dozens of men. Reported figures run past 90, all tied to Camp Lejeune, all carrying a cancer that's supposed to be almost impossible to find in groups. Male breast cancer doesn't cluster. Here it did. Meanwhile, the government's own scientists were doing the slow, unglamorous work that turned suspicion into evidence. Researchers at the ATSDR reconstructed the water chemistry going back decades, modeling, well by well, month by month, how much solvent had actually flowed to which homes. They built a dose over time record for a poisoning that ended before the science to measure it fully existed. That reconstruction is what moved this from rumor to documented fact. And slowly, the institution that had run the water started to answer for it. In 2012, Congress passed the Janie Ensminger Act, a law named for a dead 9-year-old, extending medical care to those exposed. Then, in 2022, the Camp Lejeune Justice Act, folded into the larger PACT Act, gave the exposed the right to file claims. What followed became one of the largest mass claim events in American legal history. Hundreds of thousands of filings, the reason those late-night lawyer ads asking if you lived at Camp Lejeune between 1953 and 1987 exist at all. Acknowledgement came. It just came after a great many of the sick were already in the ground. So go back to the faucet, the one that runs clear and cold and safe today, because the water is clean now, the wells are capped, the systems remediated, the base still training Marines the way it has since 1942. And that's the thing that should sit in your chest, not ruin, not rust, not an abandoned ghost base. Normalcy, restored quietly over a buried record of 34 years and up to 1 million people. Somewhere in an archive sits a Granger Laboratories report with the water flagged as contaminated, dated years before the wells went dark. Somewhere Jerry Ensminger keeps a list of the dead, the babies and wives of a base whose motto is always faithful. The tap still runs clear. That was always the problem. It never once looked like anything was wrong.